Hello, welcome for our second video of this conglomeration. Genesis 1 was the previous one, and this is Genesis 2 and 3. Genesis 1 is the creation of the world. Genesis 2 and 3 is the creation of humanity and the problem of humanity. So let's dive right in. The first question that strikes a person, well, maybe, might strike a person, when you get into Genesis 2 is this question of, now, how does this fit with Genesis 1? It's kind of like, let's do this again. Is this the same story? For example, is this day 6 in most detail? Is it kind of like we've given you the overview of everything. Now we're going to take day 6 and we're going to blow it up and we're going to show you in slow motion. You know, is that what's going on in Genesis 2, where we're seeing basically Genesis 1, day 6 amplified and blow up? Let's get that under the microscope. Or is day 6 a kind of a local creation? So we've got the uber creation, but now we've got the local creation. That's difficult too, because humanity was created in Genesis 1. So now is there already humanity here? And now we're going to create a new guy and a new girl. You know, how does it fit together? Is Genesis 2 a local after day 6, after the Sabbath? You know, day 7, God rests, and then on day 8, he creates the man and the wife, you know, in Genesis 2. Is that how it works? We notice also that there's a different order of creation in Genesis 2. So in verse 5, there's no plant. In fact, I should probably read you this so you believe me. Verse 5, when no plant of the field was yet in the earth, and no herb of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the earth, and there was no one to till the ground. That sounds like we're starting from scratch, right? But then God creates the human in verse 7, which I have on the next slide. And then after, so we have ground, and then we have the ha-adam, the man, the Adam. More on that in a second. Then in verse 9, we have the plants. And God planted a garden. Verse 9, out of the ground the Lord made to grow every tree pleasant to sight, including the tree of life in the midst of the garden. Okay, so we have ground, human, plants. Then we have animals. We have Adam, plants, and then we have animals, verse 19. So out of the ground the Lord formed every animal of the field and every bird of the air and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called every living creature, that was its name. And then it's not until verse 22 that we have the wife, the woman, Isha. And so there's a different order. So if this is the universal creation of day 6 blown up, it's not going in the same order. So there's a tension between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. I don't think we can just say, oh, you're making stuff up. If we read them both in detail, the creation of Genesis 1 is a different order of creation than the creation of Genesis 2, and yet Genesis 2 sounds like it's the initial creation. So how do we fit Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 together? Of course, if you were to go to, I've used Harvard and Yale and Princeton, oh my, as a kind of illustrative purposes. I mean, let me make up some new places. If you go to Dartmouth, if you go to the University of Florida, you're going to find a kind of source hypothesis, sometimes called the documentary hypothesis. And this was first, it kind of arose in the 1800s, but it was famously put together in the next video. As we finish up Genesis, I'll go into a little bit more detail about this theory. I'm not pushing it on you by any means. I'm just making you aware of it. But in this theory, there are multiple sources that have been edited together into Genesis as we now know it, and into the Pentateuch as we now know it. And from this perspective, Genesis 2 is seen as being from a particular one of these sources, sometimes called the J source. Again, you don't have to believe this at all. But it is true that Genesis 1 consistently calls God Elohim. Genesis 1 does not call God Yahweh. But then when we get to Genesis 2 consistently calls God Yahweh Elohim. And what you'll find is if you go through Genesis, Exodus, and Numbers, you'll find there are a number of places where you have a very similar story, and one of them will use Yahweh in it, and the other one will only use Elohim. And so a fellow by the name of Julius Wellhausen in the late 1800s, he suggested that these were two different epics, two different versions of the story of Israel that were at some point edited together. Again, you don't have to agree with that, but that's another way of explaining the tension between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And that's by suggesting that Genesis 2 comes from a different source than Genesis 1. Of course, in the previous video, I mentioned that some scholars think of Genesis 1 as a kind of preface or introduction to the Pentateuch, which would be like being a different source. Okay, so that's another suggestion that's sometimes meant. Someone else might say, well, it's the same story, but it's a different genre. The Genesis 1 is more poetic, and then Genesis 2 is more narrative. And so because they're different genres, they don't look at it quite the same, but it's the same basic series of events. So I'll let you decide. You've got a brain, and you paid money for this course, so you get to choose. I had a friend, a professor, who used to say, "You pay your money, you make your choices." So you paid for this course, you paid for this video, so to speak, and so you can decide what you think about this, how Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 fit together. Well, Genesis 2:7 is a key verse. This is the creation of the human, Ha'adam, the Adam, the man, in Genesis 2. Yahweh Elohim formed the human, Lord God. By the way, whenever I've said this before, but it bears reiteration. Whenever you see Lord in all capital letters, frankly, when you see God in all capital letters, it's Yahweh. It's the name of God that is in the Hebrew behind the translation. Yahweh Elohim formed the human from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. So one of the things that I've been arguing is that God revealed the Bible in the categories of the original audiences. And so if we follow that logic through, then we should not expect a verse like this to be writing a psychology textbook, just like we shouldn't expect Genesis 1 to be writing a physics or a cosmology or biology textbook. It's just, that's not what the genre is. We should expect Genesis 2:7 to give us a picture of humanity within the categories of ancient Hebrews. And this is arguably what it does here. So the Old Testament tends to view humans as dust with breath. And so God created, and of course, if you were to do a spectral analysis of a human being and dust, it's probably not going to be quite the same, right? I mean, I'm a carbon-based unit, not that I guess there can be carbon in dust. But I mean, when I think of dust, I don't know, I think of silicon. Maybe there's not a lot of silicon in dust. Please feel free to correct me. But clearly, human beings are more complicated chemical compositions than dust or dirt. Some overlap, no doubt. But so this is not a scientific description of chemical composition. I don't think there's any reason for us to worry about that question. What if the chemical composition of dust isn't quite the same as the chemical composition of people? Should we be troubled? No, we shouldn't be troubled. Dust here just is basically saying that humanity is made of earthen things. I mean, the elements in me are the same on the periodic table as the elements in the ground. I think that's all that we really should take from this. But humans are dust. By the way, and I have this on a slide that's coming, there seems to be the implication of that humanity was created mortal, because you may know the verse in Ecclesiastes, "You are dust, and to dust you will return." The very notion of dust in the Old Testament and humanity being dust in the Old Testament implies mortality. It took me quite a while to come around to this position, but my current position is that even the Apostle Paul, given his Jewish context, would have assumed that Adam and Eve were created mortal, and that the only reason why Adam and Eve didn't live forever is because they weren't able to eat from the tree of life. And I think this is true to what Genesis 2 and 3 seem to imply, that humanity was created of dust. So humanity was not created intrinsically to live forever. That what the reason why Adam and Eve don't live forever is because they are kicked out of the garden and don't get to eat from the tree of life. Again, feel free to disagree with that. We'll talk about inductive Bible study in the next video, and how when we read the Bible inductively, we try not to let our assumptions or glasses interfere with what we're hearing from the text. It seems to me that if we read Genesis 2:7 inductively, the implication here of humanity made of dust is that our bodies are intrinsically transitory, as it were. Breath, the word spirit and breath have a common aspect to them in Hebrew and in Greek, for that matter. And so God breathes spirit into the dust. And a living being, if you know the King James, it says here, man became a living soul. But soul in Hebrew is not a detachable part of me. In the Hebrew way of looking at things, a soul is an entire living creature, both breath and dust. This is different from the Greek way of looking at the soul. And when we get to the New Testament, we'll see that there are some expressions of the soul in the New Testament that follow the Greek paradigm and the Greek worldview, in which the soul is a detachable part of a person, but not in the Old Testament. The word soul, if it is used in translation at all in the Old Testament, does not mean a detachable part of a person, at death, cut at the dotted line and hand to God. Breath returns to God when we die, God who gave it. But soul in the Old Testament, nephesh, refers to an entire living creature. In fact, in Genesis 1, the sea creatures are called nephesh kaya, living souls. And so the word soul in Hebrew and in the Hebrew paradigm and in the Hebrew worldview is not a part of a person, but the whole living being, which is why I've translated it living being rather than living soul. So psychologists, college psychology professors are free to come up with modern scientific senses of what a human being is, without worrying about having to fit it into the categories of either Genesis, either the Hebrew or the Greek, because ultimately when God revealed what humanity is in a Hebrew worldview, he did it in the categories of a Hebrew worldview. And when God revealed himself to individuals with a Greek worldview, he did it through the lens of a Greek worldview. There is a common truth about what a human being is in all of those languages, so to speak. But we should not confuse the form of that revelation with the revelation itself. This is something we're going to, again, feel free to question this, feel free to push back on it. But this is one of this idea of revelation being incarnated revelation. God meets people where they're at and he moves them forward. And when God meets people where they're at, he meets them in their worldviews. This is one of we need to be very careful when we talk about a biblical worldview, because a great deal of what the biblical worldview is an ancient worldview. And we have to be able to distinguish between the part that's ancient and the part that's eternal. Again, this is very controversial stuff I'm saying here. I'm not making it up. I think it comes from really strong scholarship and investigation of these passages. But just so you know, this is a conversation we're going to have throughout this series of videos. But I want to make some key observations about the creation of humanity in Genesis 2. And I've already made some of them on the fly. Humanity is made from dust. I've already mentioned that. The fact that it's Ha'adam and Isha, the human and woman. Eve is the name Eve is not mentioned in Genesis 2. And Adam, the Adam, it's not Adam as in Adam as a name, it's Ha-Adam, the Adam, which suggests that the Genesis 2 story is not just talking about two people. More on that in a second, but that the human and woman are types in the story. That we are learning about the essence of humanity in Genesis 2, even more than that we're hearing about two specific individuals. More on that in a second. Again, I believe that Adam and Eve were specific individuals. There are some Christians who think that they're just expressions of types of humanity, that they weren't historical individuals. There are Christians who I believe are going to be in heaven and have strong faith. People like Francis Collins, who is very much a believer, very much believes in God. He was the one in charge of the Human Genome Project that coded the American DNA. He's very much a Christian, very much a person of faith. He does not believe that Adam and Eve were historical individuals. I do believe they were, but this is again where we're trying to listen to the other side and at least hear where they're coming from. By the way, you may notice that I don't have your stereotypical Adam and Eve behind me, because I want us to remember that we read ourselves into the biblical text. We see a Jesus who looks like us. We see an Adam and Eve that looks like us. Well, I'm a white European. I feel very confident that Adam and Eve did not look like me, probably. Well, that's another side conversation. So God wants a helper for Adam. There's been a tendency throughout history, in a lot of places, for people to assume that this means that the woman is a second level human, that she's Adam's helper. Adam is the primary, and Eve, or the woman, is kind of like there with an apron on to help cook for Ha-Adam, for man. But I want to point out, and this should be pointed out, that God is our helper. This is the same word. Psalm 54:4 uses the same word helper as is used in Genesis 2:20. And so again, we tend to read our assumptions into the biblical text, sometimes when they're not really there. And so we should be very careful not to assume that because the woman was Adam's helper, that therefore she was somehow inferior or somehow a second order human, because God is not a second order being, even though he's our helper. So again, one of those things that we want to clear up pretty quickly here, that the fact that the woman is his helper does not mean that she is his inferior. I just want to mention that a lot of times people say that, and even some versions translated as God taking a rib out of Adam. I actually had a student in a class once say, she was wrestling with this question. If God took a rib from Adam, then why do men have the same number of ribs as women? And she had a very interesting answer. She said, well, because just because one person, if I have to amputate my leg and then I were to have a child, my child would still be born with two legs, right? Genetics doesn't, what happens to one person in their specific body does not change the genetics of their offspring. But probably this whole question is misguided because the word in Genesis 2 is normally translated side. In fact, I can't think of any, I was not able to find any other place outside of Genesis 2 where the word used in the story is translated rib. It's always translated side. So Exodus 26:20 talks about the sides of the tabernacle, for example. It's not the ribs of the tabernacle. So I thought I'd clear that one up. Genesis 2 ends with this verse. And so a man will leave his father and mother and cling to his wife, and they will become one flesh. This is, of course, the paradigm verse for marriage in the Old Testament. I mentioned in a video on Deuteronomy, I think it was, that we should be careful, again, not to read our assumptions into here. So for example, there's a lot of polygamy in the Old Testament, polygamy being multiple wives. And so Does this verse preclude polygamy? No, this verse doesn't preclude polygamy, because a man would become one flesh with all of his wives, I suppose. Now, I suppose a man leaves his home only once, right? Well, that even is difficult, because in pretty much all ancient culture and in the Old Testament, it's not the man that leaves and goes to the woman's family. It's the woman who leaves her family and comes to the man's family. So this is a very curious verse, and I've actually heard Professor Sarah Dirk at Houghton College talk about how this verse is perhaps a clue that something more universal is going on in this story, rather than just a kind of blow by blow literal presentation of things, because this just isn't how it happened in the ancient world. In the ancient world, the woman left her household and became part of the man's household. So it's a very curious verse. I still am not entirely sure what to do with it, because this is just not the way it happens. And so, of course, we can do something with it. We can come up with meanings that are true. For example, I do think that when a person marries, they have to become their own person to some extent. That it's time to grow up, shall we say? Although, again, we shouldn't assume a nuclear family in the Bible. The default family in the Bible is an extended family with uncles and aunts, and when Jesus is left behind in Jerusalem in Luke chapter 2, we shouldn't assume that it's just Mary and Joseph in the van, and they forgot to put Jesus in the back seat. This is a caravan of people from the village of Nazareth, parents, grandparents, cousins, aunts, uncles. This is a large number of people. So the default family in the scriptures is an extended family, not a nuclear kind of family. That's another example of reading Western assumptions into the biblical text. Well, let's move on, shall we? There are, again, this is deeply controversial. But there are different interpretations of Genesis 2 and 3. And they don't all contradict each other necessarily, but I just want to express three main perspectives on Adam and Eve. One is that Adam and Eve express fundamental truths about humanity. And I think this is true regardless of the other issues, that Adam and Eve express fundamental truths about humanity. What are these fundamental truths? Well, Genesis 2 gives us the essence of what a human is. What is a human being? A human is God-inspired dust, where inspired means breathed into. God has breathed into humanity the spirit of life, and we are mortal bodies with something from God inside of us. Again, that's a bit of a metaphor because breath has oxygen. Breath has carbon dioxide in it, and so forth. And so I think when we talk about the spiritual side of a person, we're not talking about, I got some oxygen, or I got some carbon dioxide. That's not exactly what we mean. So even then, it's a little bit of a metaphorical kind of thing. But Genesis 2, I think one way or another, whatever you do with Adam and Eve, Genesis 2 gives us a picture of what a human being is. We are God-inspired dust. We are dust with God's breath inside of us, a metaphor of sorts. I think that's true whatever you do with the other issues. Similarly, Genesis 3 expresses the current sinful situation of humanity. I think that's true. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Now, you can hold to this. I think this is the essence of what Genesis 2 and 3 are about. You can hold to this and believe that Adam and Eve were historical individuals, like I do, or you can hold to this and believe, as Francis Collins does, that they are simply mythical, and not mythical in the sense of false, but mythical in the sense of a story expressing a mystery. A myth is not a bad science. Myths are not bad science if you understand them on a more sophisticated level. Myths are not meant to be explanatory. That's, again, a modern way of looking at these. Boy, they were really stupid. Myths were expressive. They were meant to express things. There's a story about the god Thor, the Norse god Thor, in which his hammer is stolen from him. And he dresses up like a woman, gets the guy that stole the hammer to fall in love with him. And then on their wedding day, he kills him and gets his hammer back. Now, what is strange about this story, from one point of view, is that this is meant to express why the seasons change in Norse mythology. Because when Thor doesn't have his hammer, it's winter. And when Thor gets his hammer back, it's spring. Now, what's interesting about this myth is that this can't happen repeatedly. Because one, because Thor kills the guy. And two, because if the guy could somehow come alive again, then he would know the ruse and wouldn't fall for it a second time. See what I mean? There's something deeper going on in that myth than bad science. The myth, it would seem, is expressing in Norse ways the mystery of the changing of the seasons. Now, doesn't do it for me, but it did it for them. And so it's not bad science. Well, doesn't this guy know? Doesn't he see Thor? Can't you see? He's got stubble. He hasn't shaved. He's got a beard. It's not a woman. It's not a woman. That's just misunderstanding the whole purpose of the myth. And so when Francis Collins would say that these are myths, the Adam and Eve story is a myth, he's not saying it's false. He's saying it's non-literal. Again, that's not the way I fall off the log. That's not the way John Walton falls off the log. And by the way, John Walton has written a book called The Lost World of Adam and Eve, which goes along with his Lost World of Genesis 1. But I think this idea that the Genesis 2 and 3 stories express fundamental truths about humanity, that's true no matter what you do with Adam and Eve. Now, the rest of the Bible, including Genesis 4 on, assumes that Adam and Eve were, one, real people, and two, the first humans. And so here we get at this issue that we've mentioned a little bit so far, and that's the question of whether this is part of the revelation or part of the clothing of the revelation. Is this number two, the form of the revelation, or is it the revelation itself? Is this the point, or is this on the way to the point? Again, I'm not going to talk about that in this video. I believe that Adam and Eve were real people, and there are different ways of taking that too. But let me give the third. John Walton tries to merge these two together. John Walton tries to, and as I mentioned in a previous video, he's a Bible professor, Old Testament professor at Wheaton College. He tries to merge evolution with the Adam and Eve being real people. And he basically says perhaps they are representative, kind of king priests of the humans that are around. He's trying to harmonize genetics here. Genetics would suggest that we have to come from a pool of at least 10,000 humans, hominins. Again, genetics is a quickly changing field, but as a snapshot of where it is today, genetics would suggest that our gene pool needs to have had at least a mixture of 10,000 hominins, which is way more than two. By the way, there's other voices. A guy by the name of Swamidas has basically argued, but what if God makes Adam and Eve on the side? And what if it's not that Adam and Eve are the genetic ancestors of everybody, but what if they're the genealogical ancestors of everybody? Meaning that we all are descendants of Adam and Eve. We're just not only the descendants of Adam and Eve. That's ingenious. There are other papers that have argued, no, you could argue that there's a bottleneck. Evolution, 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 Adam and Eve, and then that everybody descends from. It can't be disproven. The bottleneck theory can't be disproven. And you can find evidence for that as well. I'll send you the links if you want some of that information. But John Walton suggests both that Adam and Eve were literal historical people, but also that evolution was true and that they were representatives. Well, okay, I'm going to leave it at that and let you decide what to do with it. Genesis 3. So in Genesis 3, if Genesis 2 is the creation of Adam and Eve, Genesis 3 is what Augustine called the fall of Adam and Eve. Now, that's not biblical language. That's Augustine language from about 400 AD. There are two trees, however, this is in Genesis 3. One is a tree of knowledge of good and evil. One is the tree of life. The function of the tree of life is to give immortality to humanity. Again, I'm arguing that if we read Genesis 2 and 3 inductively, it doesn't sound like they're created immortal. It sounds like it's the tree of life that would make them live forever. This tree of the knowledge of good and evil is very interesting. It's kind of like trick. You should eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and you'll know good and evil. And when Eve eats from the tree, she knows evil because she's done it. She knows it. It's not a head knowledge, it's an experiential knowledge. Guess what? You've got evil. Kind of happens when she eats it. So it's kind of a trick. You got knowledge, all right. It's not what you expected, is it? But it would be kind of like if you cut your finger, you'll have the knowledge of cut fingers. And I cut my finger and, oh, I've got the knowledge of cut finger, not what I thought I was going to get. I thought I was going to know, but I know. Anyway, interestingly enough, if we read the Genesis 3 story inductively, it doesn't say that Satan is the serpent. Now, I believe Satan was the serpent, but there is no Jewish literature, not even the Old Testament, never identifies the serpent with Satan. Never in the Old Testament. In fact, Satan is hardly mentioned in the Old Testament. He's mentioned in Job, Zechariah, and First Chronicles. That's the only place where Satan is even mentioned in the Old Testament. There is no Jewish literature that mentions the serpent as being Satan until the 1st century before Christ. Isn't that amazing? Now, again, I believe in progressive revelation, and I believe that the serpent was Satan, but that is not part of the Genesis story. The Genesis story knows nothing inductively about Satan. And of course, they do come to know good and evil. So what does Genesis 3 say are the consequences of Adam and Eve's sin in the garden? In other words, what is the human situation? Well, one is that snakes and humans just won't be friends anymore. Now, that seems rather underwhelming when, as Christians, we've read Genesis 3 and we see the serpent as Satan, which I think is a valid way to read it. But again, that's not what a Jew would have seen, or an ancient Israelite would not have seen that in the story in the time before they even understood there was a Satan. One of the things of progressive revelation I'll talk about soon enough is that the idea of Satan is something that comes after the exile in Israel. It's not something they even understood prior to the exile. At least we have no evidence of it. And so that's a later reading where we read the snake as Satan. And so an ancient Israelite would have originally have read, I will put hatred between you and the serpent, and you will bruise his head and he will bruise your heel. A lot of times we read that as a prophecy of Jesus. And again, I have no problem with that. The New Testament doesn't really read that as a prophecy of Jesus. I mean, look through the New Testament. You find a couple allusions to this story. You really do. Paul says, I think it's in Romans 16, that God will crush Satan under your feet. But that's not Jesus crushing Satan. That's the church crushing Jesus. And of course, Revelation depicts Satan as a dragon, and there's snake-like overtones. And so there are clear enough evidences that the New Testament authors understood the snake to be Satan. But there really isn't a prophecy fulfillment kind of statement in the New Testament about you will bruise his head and he will bruise your heel. That's a later Christian tradition. Again, I have no problem with reading it that way. However, how would an ancient Israelite have read that? Well, I think an ancient Israelite would have read it as, well, that's why snakes and humans don't get along, because of this garden incident. The story expresses something about humanity. And so snakes and humans just won't be friends anymore. Women are going to have painful childbirth. Check, still happens. We do have epidurals and things like that make childbirth better than and more survivable than it used to be. By the way, no one would say, I'm sorry, this is a consequence of the fall. You can't have an epidural when you're giving birth. Nobody would say that. I hope nobody would say that. And so There are some who would say, okay, Genesis 3 says that the wife has to be submissive to the husband, and therefore, even though it's not going to be like that in heaven, we got to do that on earth because Eve sinned. Again, there's no reason why this can't be seen as a descriptive kind of thing. Your desire will be, this is said to Eve, your desire will be for your husband, but he will dominate you. He will kind of be an autocrat over you. That is better taken, I think, as a description of a fallen situation than as anything like God's ideal. And so, as I will say at other places in our time through this sequence, that if we can make the world more like the kingdom now, why would we wait? If we can do away with slavery as an institution now, why wouldn't we wait? Even though there is slavery in the New Testament, masters, treat your slaves this way, slaves obey your masters, even though that language is in the New Testament. And by the way, Christian slave owners used that as an argument against abolition in the early 1800s. We, as a nation, found a way, and not just us, but other Western nations like England and so forth, found a way to move beyond even what the biblical texts suggest, to move even closer to the kingdom of God than the biblical texts even suggested, and do away with slavery altogether. And so we are not locked into a painful childbirth if science invents epidurals. And similarly, we are not locked into dominating husbands, even though that is a description rather than a prescription, a description of the way a lot of cultures and patriarchal cultures, most cultures in history have been patriarchal, where the male dominates. I don't think we take that as God's plan for creation, but as a symptom of the problem of a fallen world. And if we can undo it here on earth, by all means, let's undo it and afford equality between men and women on earth. Men will find the ground uncooperative. Again, we've invented farming implements. We have big tractors and combine harvesters and things like that. Oh, I'm sorry, you can't use a tractor. You're going to have to use a hoe or your hands, or something like that. Again, that's not the spirit of the text. It's descriptive. It's describing the human situation. It's not saying, and this is what you must do. And of course, dust you are, and to dust you will return. I've already talked about as part of the human situation. That sense, again, you don't have to agree with me, but it seems to me that if we listen to the Genesis text, it suggests that death was the default from the very beginning, and that the possibility of eternal life, that was the change in the garden. There are a whole host of glasses that we use when reading the Genesis story that are later glasses. So when I grew up reading the Genesis story, I not only read with my dictionary and my assumptions of my world, but I come from what we might call the holiness tradition, Wesleyan holiness tradition. And so I read not only through my assumptions, but through the assumptions of the holiness tradition I came from. Where did the holiness tradition come from? It came from John Wesley in the 1700s. And so I read it through my glasses, reading the holiness tradition, reading through the Wesley. Wesley read Calvin. Calvin read Augustine. Augustine read Paul. Paul read Genesis. So I when I started out reading Genesis 3, I didn't start off just seeing it as it is. Not that I totally see it that way even now. I'm doing my best, as we all do. But it was Ken's assumptions, reading through a holiness lens, reading through a Wesley lens, reading through a Calvin lens, reading through an Augustine lens, reading through a Paul lens, reading Genesis. It's like a room that's been painted over and over and over again. And you're trying to find the original wall, but you're not quite sure whether that bump is a glob of paint from Augustine or whether it's actually part of the original meaning of Genesis. This is part of the problem. So things like sinful nature, not mentioned in Genesis. In fact, I would argue that sinful nature isn't even mentioned in Paul, that's a Augustine lens, that Paul uses the word, we are in the flesh. He doesn't say we have a sinful nature. Paul never says that in the Greek. Disobedience is not a word used in Genesis 3. Condemnation is not a word used in Genesis 3. The fall is an Augustine language. Augustine in the 400s has really influenced the way that Protestants especially read Genesis chapter 3. And so in terms of the original meaning of Genesis 3, we should probably take it as an expression of the human situation. That doesn't mean that other readings are wrong. It's not wrong, for example, for us to read it through the lens of Paul. And it's not wrong for us to read Genesis 3:15 as a kind of anticipation of Jesus. Those are what we might call fuller readings, or spiritual readings, or there was a Latin term for it, sensus plenior, a kind of fuller sense to the text. But part of what I hope we'll get as we go through this series is a sense of how to read a text, a biblical text, inductively for what it actually meant originally. And of course, there will always be debate. Well, this has been the video on Genesis 2 and 3 and Adam and Eve.